We first kind of noticed and got really excited about Paul Kingsnorth back in 2020 in that momentous and surreal year. And rumour reached us here at UnHerd that this left environmentalist, this former editor of The Ecologist, was somehow on a political journey. And we love people who are on political journeys here. He was moving between categories. He was leaving his herd, and we kind of seized on him, and we brought him on the YouTube channel. We're delighted to say he published some of his finest essays, I think, here at UnHerd. And since then, he's been developing his thought on his own Substack, and it has culminated, really, in this really remarkable book, Against the Machine, that is launching today. This is the day of publication. Really happy that the very first event and discussion of it is taking place here at UnHerd. And as he says himself, this is his magnum opus. We were joking earlier that he plans to just direct people to certain pages in it if they ask him any questions. It is the summary so far of his thinking. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's meet him, Paul Kingsnorth. Well, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much. Nice to be here. Always good.
And congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
This is the first of quite a big tour.
It is. I've got 3 weeks of doing events and now, starting today, literally. So this is the first one. And then I'm going to America tomorrow, and then I'm back in 3 weeks, and then I've got some British events coming up in November. So I'll be absolutely sick of the book by the end of that.
Yeah, and also we get you before you've practiced.
You do.
Your answers.
Yeah, if you come to the end of the tour, I'll be terrible, but I'm still fresh.
What you're seeing here this evening is the authentic first responses to these questions.
Good or not, we'll see.
You cover an enormous amount in this book, and we won't be able to kind of go through every chapter, but I thought the best thing to do is to begin by laying out the thesis, essentially. And what struck me is that it begins with a feeling. And what I mean by that is, like so much of your writing, there's a sense that you have always had a kind of alienation from the modern world, some profound sense of loss or yearning to get back to something that perhaps we had before. Tell us about that feeling, and has it always been with you?
Yeah, I think it does start with a feeling. I think most of my writing starts with a feeling or with an intuition. That seems to be the kind of writer I am. I'm not an academic writer. The intuition comes first, and then I follow the intuition to see where it comes from and what it is and why I feel like that. And you said it was my magnum opus, which I sort of jokingly say, but it's also true. I mean, I've written, I think it's 11 books now, fiction and non-fiction and poetry, and all of them, especially the non-fiction, are circling around this thing I've ended up calling the machine here. And we can talk about why I call it the machine in a minute, if you like. But it is a feeling. It's a sense that we are living inside something that is quite inhuman and becoming more and more inhuman. It's a system that you can feel encroaching upon you, and it becomes tighter and tighter and tighter. One of the things I begin the book with is a poem by the American poet Robinson Jeffers, who I'm a big fan of, who wrote this wonderful poem called The Purse Seine in the 1940s, and he was sitting on a cliff in Los Angeles in California, and he was watching a fishing boat drawing in a net, and there's a type of net called a purse seine where you collect the fish in the net, and then it's like a drawstring. You draw it and draw it and draw it and draw it, and he writes about how the fish in the net can't feel the net being tightened and drawn, but it tightens up all the time and until they're in it and they're stuck. And it feels to me like that's where we are. And something else I say in the book, of course, is that the net is what we spend most of our time on now. If you call it the net and you call it the web, maybe you want to think about whether it's catching you, whether you're the prey. So there is a feeling, there's a sense that certainly something is gathering around us, but also we're actually losing things that make us human, which is why the subtitle of this book is on the unmaking of humanity. This is not an original observation, needless to say. I start the book by talking about the many writers that have used this phrase, the machine, before me. It's not my phrase. I consider myself, hopefully, to be writing in this tradition. This is something that's been going on for hundreds of years, at least since the Industrial Revolution. People can feel this thing tightening around us, and it's been tightening around us. And we normalise it all the time. So, I mean, I'm very struck when I come into London, because I live in the west of Ireland, and every time I come to London, it's become more machine-like. Right, so you can walk through the airport now, go into a cafe in the airport. There aren't any menus anymore. There's a little QR code on the table. You have to scan it to find out what the menu is. There are cameras everywhere. You're constantly being monitored. Everything's got a hotel room where you have to fiddle with an iPad in order to close the curtains, all sorts of stuff like this, which is just normal now. And it wasn't normal 5 years ago. And it's become more and more impossible to survive without being hooked into this technological web that's just growing around us. And the question I've always had is, what does that take away? We know what it gives us. We can decide whether we like what it gives us. It gives us some good things and some bad things, but what do we lose? I think most people can feel that we're losing something or a set of things that are quite important to what it means to be human. And sometimes you have to step outside it to try and look inside it to see what it is that's being taken away. Because if you're in the per se net being slowly drawn in, it's like boiling a frog or something, to mix the metaphors and the images. It's happening quite slowly, but something's being drained away at the same time. So I think that's always the question I've been chasing. What is it that's missing? And is it just missing in me because I'm a weirdo who can't adjust to society, or is it something that actually is objectively happening in a bigger way?
I remember reading Real England, an earlier book of yours, where that was also infused with that same sense that modernity, the kind of carapace of technology and concrete that was covering the kind of authentic country of England, you had a very strong negative reaction to. I mean, if someone says, do you hate modernity, what would you reply?
Well, the easy answer is yes, but but we've got an hour, so I probably have to say more than that, don't I, so that you get your money's worth.
I would just say it's remarkable that you do say that.
Well, I mean, look, what is modernity? What are we talking about here? Are we talking about a historical time period that we could maybe date from a particular period, maybe the Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution or the end of the Middle Ages or something like that? Or are we talking about a way of seeing? I prefer to see modernity as a way of seeing. It's the way of seeing that in the book is I often refer to it as machine modernity. And it's a way of seeing that I think leads to the dominance of a particular perspective that we have. I talk in the book about a lot of other writers. I spend a lot of time reviewing the history and other writers who talked about this as a way to kind of build on it. One of the writers I talk about is Ian McGilchrist, who you've talked to here before, who is very brilliant, and many of you may know him. Ian McGilchrist's way of looking at this, and Ian McGilchrist's new book, which is a 2-volume book called The Matter with Things, the appendix of that book is bigger than my entire book. So, and I'm not equipped to judge his science, but, he has this great theory about the hemispheres of the brain. The left hemisphere sees the parts, and the right hemisphere sees the whole. The part of the brain that sees the parts is supposed to be in service to the part that sees the whole. So whether or not you see that as a psychiatric or scientific point, or whether you see it as a psychological or a philosophical one, we have become deeply left-brained in the sense that we're very good at seeing the parts, very good at making things, very good at creating gizmos and wonders, very good at going to the moon, very good at examining the genes of fruit flies and the rest of it. Some of this can be very useful to us, obviously. But again, have you actually lost a way of seeing that's much more significant? Have you lost a way of understanding what the big picture of the world is? What is your relationship to community, to place, to God, to what it actually means to be a human, to the natural world? What is going under the dominance of this very mechanistic, very left-brain society that's excellent at seeing the parts and taking them apart, but is hopeless at seeing the whole? And that's what I see modernity as being. And it creates lots of things that we find good and useful, obviously. But where's it going in the long term? And what's the price that's being paid for it? That's the question.
You do, in Against the Machine, sketch out a little bit of a history of how we got to here. Or you talk about some points where the change became more rapid, some important markers on the way. I mean, where do you think, some candidates for where it all began going wrong? I mean, you mentioned everyone from Aquinas, Duns Scotus, the Schism, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, invention of the car, and many others.
Got it all in there.
What do you think of as the kind of key moment where this breach really began in earnest?
Well, you missed a bit about the Egyptian pyramids.
Oh, yes, I guess.
Which isn't my idea. I'm quoting Lewis Mumford, the great critic of technology, who wrote this enormous book, 2-volume book called The Myth of the Machine, back in the late 1960s. And Mumford really sees, and I think he's right, Mumford sees the machine as a way of seeing which manifests and rises and falls throughout history. He sees the first machine society, the first example of what he calls the mega machine, as pharaonic Egypt, which he calls a machine made of human parts, the human parts being slaves. And if you have that enormous top-down thing, you can build something incredible like a pyramid, which is what he has one section in the book actually where he compares a pyramid to a space rocket. He says these are both technologies which at a cost of huge human labor and toil create a technology which takes the favored few up into heaven, which I quite like. So I think that what's happening in the modern world, what we call modernity, this time period or this way of seeing, is a manifestation of a particular way of seeing that we have, which rises and falls again and again. You could say that Egypt was a machine society. Certainly ancient Rome was very machine-like in terms of its centralization, its technocratic ability, its top-down power. What's happened since, I would say, probably let's say the 18th century, let's finger the usual suspects and say the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution together, I think they create a revolution in human seeing here in the Western world, which has since flooded out everywhere else. And this is this way of seeing, which is, as I say, highly mechanistic. And ultimately, what it does is it, through the use of, well, really through a critique of religion, which has been going on for a long, long time, long before the Enlightenment, but it really comes to the fore in, say, the French Revolution and later on, you create a new theology. And I think this is quite important because maybe a traditional way of understanding this is that during the modern period, we've moved away from religion and we've moved instead towards reason and science. To some degree, you could maybe say that's true. But what we also have is a new belief system. And we believe primarily in a thing we call progress, which is moral progress, technological progress, endless forward movement. Things will always get better. There may be a few dips and rises and falls, but effectively we're moving towards probably some form of utopia. And if we look at the way that our politics is framed, if we look at the way technology is created now, they all are aligned with this notion of progress with a large P. So we're all progressive in that sense, not in the necessarily narrow political sense, but we all believe in this forward movement. And it's become almost a theology or the ultimate philosophy of the modern world. That's what we do. We move forward. And I think one of the problems we're having at the moment in the West is that people have stopped believing in it. It doesn't work anymore for all sorts of reasons. And because we haven't got anything else to believe in, everything's erupting in all sorts of different ways. So I would say the last 200 to 300 years in the West have been an enormous intellectual and cultural and physical and technological revolution, which is still playing out, actually. And a lot of the ructions that we see today that I think we imagine are cultural and political have a much deeper root in that, which overturns a complete way of seeing that we had before.
This, for me, is a really crucial distinction. Is this new, or was it ever thus? And I suspect on this long book tour you're now going to go, people will ask you varieties of this same question, which is that, has it not always been true throughout the ages that there are people such as yourself who yearn for the simpler purity, the oneness of the past? I mean, Ovid was writing about the Golden Age, and William Morris, and you could find characters throughout history. Are you just one of them, the today's version, or do you think you found something that is truly specific and new about what we're going through today?
Well, I don't mind being compared with Ovid. That's okay. I mean, look, firstly, I don't believe in purity, so you have to be careful. The temptation when you talk like this is to find a particular period in the past and start to romanticize that and say, well, everything was great then. And probably, if we're honest, all of us can find a period in history that we'd prefer to live in. It's quite a fun sort of pub question or something after you've had a pint or two.
What would yours be?
Where would you actually live? It's a very good question, actually. I thought about this. I think it's a kind of combination of rural England before World War I and the Paleolithic 30,000 years ago. So it's kind of rural England pre-war, but with mammoths.
So discovering
which I think
fossils,
would be great.
maybe,
Someone once told me I should write a novel about that, which I think would actually be fun. But so you can do that, but it's, you won't find a period in history in which there aren't all the usual human problems, but they are different. So I don't think you can say 'twas ever thus, because it wasn't ever thus. Societies have been very different. Medieval Europe was very different. Aboriginal Australia is radically different. Native American cultures are radically different. Pre-Christian Europe was radically different. So cultures have very, very different values and different ways of relating to nature. But I think you still can say, in a very general sense, that the modern way of seeing divorces us from things which most pre-modern ways of seeing have taken for granted. I try and categorize this in the book in a very machine-like way, actually. I call it the 4 Ps, which are people, place, prayer, and the past. And I say, well, if you look at most cultures throughout most times, they're based on a combination of those 4 things, right? So there's a people, there's a community that you're part of, There's the place, there's your relationship to nature, which is the place you're in, maybe the place you come from, maybe the place you've arrived in, but you're in it in a way that allows you to have a relationship with the natural world. There's prayer, which is your relationship to God. And there's the past, which is your sense that you're in a tradition, that you're coming from somewhere and therefore you're going somewhere. And I think most cultures throughout most times have existed in a kind of matrix of those four things. And the modern world systematically uproots them all and replaces them with consumerism and ideologies and progressive theologies and ultimately technology, which is the way that we try and manifest the myth of progress. So I think you can say there's something I agree with Ian McGilchrist on this one, actually. There is something radically revolutionary about the way we see. And it's not normal, even though there have been many different cultures and many different rises and falls of things and all sorts of problems in all sorts of ways in the past. I think we see the world quite differently to the way most people have always seen it.
And is that connected to the globalized nature of our culture? You trace 1850 as a key year in England, where more people lived in cities than in the country, and those cities then became what you call a grid of similar cosmopolis that kind of eventually covered the whole surface of the earth. Is the globalized nature of our culture what part of what makes it distinct, do you think?
Well, I think maybe, but also, there have always been empires. There have always been, the empires of Alexander the Great, or the empires of Rome, or indeed the empires of certain Native American kingdoms, or the Aztecs. So it's humans expanding their range into lots of different places is not new. But what we're calling globalization now is really the spread of commerce and the spread of this way of seeing around the world, which the European empires do very effectively in the 18th and 19th centuries. There's a chapter in there in which I talk about the way that the Americans bust open Japan in the 1860s. They turn up with their black ships and basically threaten them and say, we're coming to introduce a market economy into this, what is effectively a very traditional, very hidebound samurai society. And the Americans turn up. The Japanese they've literally had their borders closed. I mean, Donald Trump's got nothing on them. They've had their borders closed for 100 years. They won't let anyone in, and they barely let anyone out. And suddenly these Americans turn up with these steamships and guns, and they say, right, we need a trade treaty, otherwise we're invading, effectively. And they're forced to break everything open, and their society effectively collapses. There's a bit of a revolution. The Japanese realize they have to modernize, and so they start modernizing very fast. And once you have this technology, and once you have this way of seeing, which is extremely commercial, very progressive, very profit-driven, very universalist in the sense that you believe these values are universal, and also you just want stuff. Globalization is inevitable because you will just go everywhere, and you will take this stuff where you can take it, and if you have advanced military technology, you'll be able to colonize whoever hasn't got it. So globalization has been going on for a long time. For a long time, people in the West benefited from it, and now people in the West are also getting shafted by it, which is why there's a culture war, one of the reasons there's a culture war at the moment. So yes, that kind of machine globalization, the spread of this way of seeing out of where it comes from, which is effectively Western Europe, to everywhere else on Earth where it now is probably inevitable once you get that level of technological development. And once you discover fossil fuels, which I think are maybe the really big thing that globalizes this whole thing and makes the machine age radically different. The discovery of coal and oil gives us an enormous amount of power that no society's ever had. Everything in the past has had to be run on water power or wood power, or maybe, scraping up a bit of coal from the top of the land. But once you can mine fossil fuels and dig oil wells and use that to power society, you've got a level of power that you've never had before. And that's another thing that makes it unprecedented.
You chart the story of this monster almost that began with the cities and the spread, but then really fast forwarded with modern technology. And what is quite striking and very different, I think, about the way you see it is we're very used to people complaining about people having too much screen time and the deleterious effects of apps and that kind of stuff. But you really seem to see the spread of modern technology, perhaps culminating in AI, or that's its latest stage, really as something devilish, a kind of spirit almost. I just want to read one sentence from your book. Imagine that some being of pure materiality, some being opposed to the good, some ice-cold intelligence from an ice-cold realm, were trying to manifest itself here. How would it appear? Not surely as clumsy, messy flesh, Better to inhabit, to become a network of wires and cobalt, of billions of tiny silicon brains, each connected to a human brain whose energy and power and information and impulses and thoughts and feelings could all be harvested to form the substrate of an entirely new being. So it's a being.
Well, I'm writing there about Rudolf Steiner and his theory about Ahriman, this great manifestation of this icy being. And I've got a couple of chapters where I try to get to the heart of what probably more than 2 chapters actually, because this really interests me, the spiritual roots of what's going on in digital tech, which is moving towards AI. Because I don't think you can see this in purely material terms as a collection of ones and zeros in a machine, or just, capitalism doing what it does, profiteering. I mean, those things are all true. But if you listen to the people who are in Silicon Valley really pushing the creation of superhuman intelligences, they all talk like prophets or priests or religious philosophers. So Ray Kurzweil, who's the great prophet of the singularity, who wrote a book many years ago called The Age of Spiritual Machines. He's always talking about the singularity, the point at which machines become more intelligent than us and basically run away with themselves. He was once asked, does God exist? And he said, not yet. And there's a lot of quotes in the book from people like this. They talk about making God. They say they're building God. They say, journalist Ezra Klein in the New York Times actually went around to a bunch of AI developers. And you may have seen lots and lots of warnings from people about how AI could become super intelligent and destroy us. Many of those warnings are coming from the people creating it. This is the really disturbing and sinister thing. It's not just weirdos like me saying this is bad. It's the people creating this stuff who are saying, we don't know why it's doing this. We don't know how it works. Something's happening. So Ezra Klein went to a bunch of these people and he said, given that you are warning us that this could destroy the world, why are you creating it? And he said they couldn't really answer the question, but they ended up more or less feeling that they had a responsibility to usher this new being into the world, right? So if you start to see this in spiritual terms, you go, they're all talking about making God, creating God, ushering in new beings. We've got super intelligences being created. Nobody really knows how they work. They're already talking to each other in ways people can't understand. They're already persuading teenagers to kill themselves. Something very sinister is going on. And if you take seriously the kind of theology behind it, I think you see something that, again, pre-modern societies probably wouldn't have had much trouble understanding what was going on. It's like a Greek myth or something, right? Or indeed it's like the book of Genesis where the serpent says, well, why don't you just eat that apple? Why don't you just take the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and you shall become as gods, which is the promise right at the beginning of the Christian and the Jewish creation myth. If you rebel against God, you can be God yourself. That's what we're doing. We're trying to create God, make God, live forever. These people all talk like this. And Marshall McLuhan, actually, years ago in his great book about media and technology, Understanding Media, he said that digital technology was in the process of creating a central nervous system for something that was manifesting. So quite how you see that, however you see that, I think there's something going on.
How do you see that?
Well, I don't know, you see. I don't know.
Is this just the excitable rhetoric of Silicon Valley
well, it could
technicians?
Be.
Or
like
do you think
so.
There is an external force of some kind that is being made manifest?
Well, I'm a Christian, so I do believe in external forces of evil, yes. I don't want to get too carried away with that because it's very easy to predict the rise of the Antichrist every 5 minutes. Okay. That's been happening quite a lot for a couple of thousand years. Actually, my American publisher emailed me today and she said, congratulations on the book publication. You may not know this, but according to some American evangelicals, today is the day on which the world is officially going to end.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, and I said, well, not before the book's come out, surely. This is it's so unfair. Yeah, so you have to be a bit careful with the kind of religious rhetoric not to get carried away. But, I do. The more I get engaged in this, I tend to see the internet these days as a giant Ouija board, honestly, with all sorts of things coming through it. So who knows what exactly is going on? To come back to your first question, it's kind of a feeling. It's an intuition. I'm not trying to prove anything. But I think given that all these people talk in spiritual terms about this stuff, we should see it in spiritual terms. And even if we don't want to talk about things manifesting through technology, we can certainly see our relationship to technology and our addiction to it and the way it controls us and the way it controls our children actually as a spiritual matter in terms of, the way we might have a relationship to God, the way we have a relationship to our culture, to our families, to our children. That's all affected by this, the actual deliberately manufactured addiction to this stuff. And is also affected by the fact that the people who are creating these technologies, which we all now have to use, whether we like it or not, believe in these things. They actually are trying to push this stuff in a direction that's not just about making a ton of money, although of course they want to do that. They're trying to create superhuman intelligences because they actually believe these things will save the world, make the world better, allow us to be immortal, solve all the world's problems. I mean, the one appealing argument I have heard from them is that if we were to replace all our politicians with AIs, they'd probably do a better job. Which, but I mean, there's something to it.
I just want to ask one more time about this, because I feel it's such a... And I can see that there's a sort of shyness about it, because it's easy to parody or take out of context. You do take that step in this book, so I feel it's fair.
Yeah, totally.
That you seem to genuinely think that a dark force, a devilish force, you name it, the Antichrist, is kind of evident in the gathering of the technological noose around us. I mean, you say these machines are not just machines, they are something else, a body whose mind is in the process of developing, a body beginning to come to life. I mean,
I think that's true. Yeah, no, I'll stand by that. I don't know what the mind is. I don't know whether the mind is something, or whether it is Antichrist, or whether it is Ahriman, or whether it's something demonic, or whether it's something that humans can create as they're trying to create it. I'm not sure we're actually capable of creating a mind, even though we think we are. But I have the strong sense that something quite dark is happening. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want to put a name to it, but I mean, let's just see what happens over the next 5 years, because either AI is going to be a bubble that bursts and we've all just made a big fuss about nothing, or we're going to be moving into very uncharted territory, I would say. So yeah, I do think there's something going on there. I mean, it's interesting that you quote this back to me, because when I started writing the book, I didn't expect it to go in that direction. And then the more I did the reading and the more I did the studying and the more I examined what was going on, I thought, I think there's something going on at a level that we don't usually talk about, so what the hell, I'm just going to say it. So,
and you have. You've taken the step.
So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Let me take you away from the perilous topic of the Antichrist towards the easy topic of the culture wars. So that will be plain sailing.
It's less interesting, though.
We may go back to it. You talk about 3 consecutive feelings you have when confronted with this now kind of raging cultural war that is happening. Can you remember what they are, or shall I quote them back at you?
Well, I was writing these essays that became this book I think I started in 21 or 20 or something, so it's kind of right at the height of, woke versus based stuff, which, as you say, has kind of gone into a strange accelerated territory now. And again, actually, one of the things that almost motivated me to start writing this at all was looking at the culture war and saying, what are people fighting about? What's going on here? What's the root of all this, right? Obviously, there's always been left-right politics and things, but there's something really deep going on. People have got a real existential battle about what they think the culture is and who's in charge of it and what its values are and what is it. And I wanted to know what it was. And when I looked at the sort of warring teams, I thought, yeah, I think my first kind of reaction was to look at the mad woke left and want to join the team against them, because some of the stuff they say is just so crazy and offensive. And then the second reaction is, actually, no, I really don't want to do that. I don't want to get involved in that. I think I'd rather go and live in a forest or a monastery, because that's actually a trap. I think it is a trap. And then the third reaction was to look at it and say, okay, well, look, I really don't like what a lot of these people are saying, but I can understand why they're saying it. Because the bigger point, I suppose, and I have
these people being the original woke,
these people being the kind of,
the
postmodern woke left, whatever you want to call them, the culture warriors who are trying to take the culture apart. And, so you have these people on the left, if that's what you want to call them, that are really trying to dismantle the culture from its roots, question all of its values, pull everything apart, impose radical new ideas. And then rising up against them, you have these kind of defenders of the West, broadly on the right, we must defend our traditions and all the rest of it. And when I look at that, I think, well, I'm not sure what traditions we're defending at this point. I'm not sure what the West is. So if you're going to defend the West, or indeed attack the West, you need to think, well, what is it then? And if I'm talking about the machine, I think that is what the modern West is. It may not be what the West was in the Middle Ages, if it even existed, when it was Christendom, but this thing we call the West now is really a manifestation of this modern way of seeing that we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes. I actually don't want to defend that. So I find myself in this kind of bind, because I come from here and I'd rather that place wasn't dismantled. I've got children who've got to grow up in it. I want to give them some values. But while I can dislike what a lot of the radical left is doing, I can see to some degree why they're doing it. I'm not convinced by the uncomplicated, unquestioning defenders of the West, because what they often end up defending is kind of capitalism, a very statist version of Christianity, a 1950s style conservatism that actually they probably don't really want to live in themselves.
But so you're ready to let it die. I mean, there is a chapter called "The West Must Die."
Yeah, and what I'm thinking here is exactly. So I like to overstate things. It's basically what my literary style comes down to. You spotted it. You spotted it. You called me out, as they say on the left.
Well, the full sentence is maybe, just maybe, we need to let the West die. Let it die so that we can live.
So what I'm thinking here is this thing that we call the West, which has become an idol, right? Either because the left want to tear it down because it's the cis heteronormative patriarchy, or because the right want to defend it because the left are trying to tear it down, has become a thing which actually doesn't have anything to do with real culture at all. It's almost like a trauma response. We've lost all of our actual real culture. If we go back to those 4 Ps, people, place, prayer in the past, most of us aren't living in most of those things anymore. I mean, it's patchy, but so we can't generalize too much. But modernity has stripped so much of that stuff away from us that we end up in this battle over a thing we call the West, which actually, when we look at it, we don't know how to define it. One of the lines I used in the book was quite early on, I think, is that you have a culture war when you don't have a culture. And I think about, I live in the west of Ireland. I can talk to go around to visit my neighbour who's about 85 and sit and chat in her living room with her. If I were to ask her what her identity was, she would have no idea what I was talking about, right? She would have no idea what any of this means. She's Irish, but in an unquestioning way. She's a Catholic because she just is, because she comes from a much more traditional culture. And you don't have to talk about those things if those things aren't under threat. You only have to have a culture war when your culture is already, I think, undermined. So if we let go of this notion of the West, whether we're attacking it or defending it, maybe we can concentrate on creating human-scale cultures again, which is, I think, the best way to create some form of friction or resistance to this machine way of seeing, is actually going down to the roots. You can't do the big stuff effectively. I'm not saying you shouldn't have big arguments at all, that none of these issues matter. They do. You have to stand up for things that are true. You have to stand up against things that are wrong or evil. But actually the real stuff is going to come from trying to recreate real culture again. Defend it if it's still there, but recreate it again at the human level, which is harder work than fighting on the internet, although less stimulating as well.
And that is the kind of final part of your book, really, where you lay out this history and what you've been talking about, and conclude by offering a suggestion of how we might live in it. It's a kind of secession from the crumbling culture around us, basically acceptance that it's crumbling and may not survive, and a focus on smaller things connecting to the earth and so on. Will you just talk a bit about how that would work for people?
Well, I think it's already crumbled. I mean, I have, this is a position I've got to. I just think that the culture's already crumbled. The things that we used to believe in or be attached to, or the things that formed it, have pretty much already gone. That sort of gives you a freedom to start again. Not that you are going to start with a blank slate. You need to draw on the best of the past. But at the same time, we're in a position where we have had this enormous, radical, revolutionary wave of technology and ideology and politics and capitalism and consumerism, all the rest of it, that's swept over the world, for better or worse, for 300 years and has ripped everything up. I mean, one of the best descriptions of this actually comes from the Communist Manifesto, which is a beautiful piece of writing. I've never been a communist at all. I'm not a Marxist, but Marx's description, a very famous description of the way that all fixed, frozen relations are swept away and everything is torn up by what he calls bourgeois capitalism, is quite correct. And he's talking about this in 1850. The machine rips up everything from its roots. And that's a kind of liberation process, but it's also a destruction process. And to go back to that thing we were talking about with nostalgia, it's always tempting to look to a place in the past and say, if we can only go back to then, before all these crazy woke people were here, or before all these capitalists were here, or whatever it is, before the technology existed to do this. Well, you can't do that anyway. It's not possible to do it. You can draw on the past, but you can't go back to the past, so you don't need to do it. You need to try and build from the bottom up. So this is the difficult bit, of course. The end of the book is also the hardest bit to write, because it's very easy to complain about things. I'm very good at that. I quite enjoy analysing everything that's wrong, but trying to work out what you should do instead is the difficult part. And that's something else I've done in all of my books, really. Someone once told me about a publishing convention that they have with books like this, with the last chapter, which they call the happy chapter, right? So you write 300 pages of doom and horror, and then you have a chapter with but it's okay because we just do these 5 things and everything will be all right. but I haven't done that. It's difficult to distill into bullet points. But I've got...
Well, it's happier,
It's happy.
I would
It is
say.
happy. Well, strangely enough, this is all very doomy. We're all talking about Antichrist and things. And, for a Christian, actually, the coming of Antichrist is all good because it's all fine after that. Everything gets sorted, so we're waiting for that day. But, it is, weirdly enough, even though the world looks crazy and horrible and depressing in a lot of ways, I'm not going to say it's an optimistic time, but there's a hope to it precisely because everything's kind of fallen down. And you can now say, well, okay, how are we going to get back to actually trying to be human again? Once you're forced to face this kind of digital Moloch that's around you all the time, you actually have to ask questions about what it means to be human, whether you agree with any of the things I'm saying here. Do you care about any of this or not? And if you do, what are you going to do about it? So I suppose I was thinking about this earlier because I knew you'd ask me this. And I think I've got a few chapters at the end of the book in which I try to say, okay, how can we live through this? And that's the question I try to ask, not how can we solve all the problems or how can we come up with a big theory that will make things better, because I don't think you can. Things have to be human scale. But how can you live through it? Where's the escape hatch, actually, is one of the questions I ask. And I think there are 3 levels you can think about it. So the first level is a very micro-personal level. It's about what you do in your life. And everybody's going to be able to do different things because we all have different lives. Okay, so what's your relationship with technology going to be? How much time are you going to spend on a screen? How are you going to give screens to your children? Where are you going to live? How much time are you going to spend in nature? How much time are you going to try and spend with friends and family? How much time are you going to spend cooking food? All of these things that are just very small, normal human things that are repeatedly taken away from us. There's a whole chapter in the book about how the home is systematically dismantled, basically, by consumer capitalism, and everything is turned into a process of buying and selling. So in that context, even growing and cooking your own food is a radical act. This is what Wendell Berry's been writing about for the last 60 years. So there's that level of what you actually do in your life, what relationship you have with technology and culture. Then there's a slightly higher level. I talk about James C. Scott. I think we've sat on this stage and talked about him before, actually. Brilliant writer who wrote a couple of books as a kind of anarchist historian, and he wrote a book called The Art of Not Being Governed, which I talk about quite a lot in the book. And it's actually about the hill tribes of Southeast Asia and how they managed to avoid being swept into the states that grew up around there. And he quotes an ancient Chinese document in which the Chinese government, the Chinese state, is talking about a particular tribe called the Li. And they talk about 2 types of Li. They talk about the raw and the cooked. So the raw barbarians, the raw Li, they're the ones who live in the caves in the mountains, and they can't get them to use their labor for the army. They can't tax them. They can't force them to do anything. But then you've got another group of them, probably a larger group, that lives in the city walls, and they pay the taxes and they live according to the rules of the culture, but the state doesn't trust them because they seem to be in league with the raw barbarians up there. They're sort of dissidents within the gates. So do you want to be a raw barbarian or a cooked barbarian is then the slightly different question. Most of us will be cooked. But what does that mean? How are you going to, what's your philosophy of it? And then the third level is the really big picture, coming back to the whole Antichrist question. One of the people I quote in the book is Eliza Yudkowsky, who's a kind of mad Silicon Valley eccentric, but very, very opposed to AI. In fact, he's got a book coming out, maybe even next week, certainly this month, which is called If Someone Builds It, Everyone Dies. So you think my writing is over the top, right? So he's much more radical than me, but he thinks that AI systems are inevitably going to destroy us. And his solution to this is you need an immediate global moratorium on any AI development. And if anyone is found developing AI in their countries, then you need to immediately bomb the data centers of the country and destroy the electricity network. So he's a kind of Silicon Valley Ted Kaczynski, But, you're going to get
you talk about that, bombing the data centers.
Totally.
You describe that as something that a raw ascetic might think of.
Well, not a raw ascetic, but a raw barbarian, yeah. Well, this is the question, right? How raw do you want to be? How cooked do you want to be? But it also comes back to this question of where things go over the next 5 to 10 years.
But on the bombing the data centers, it's in the book.
It is.
You say, bombing the data centers, this is the mindset of the raw ascetic. So I would say, although you're not explicitly calling for it, you're not calling for it by including it as one of the thoughts.
So you choose whether to go raw or cooked. I'm obviously cooked, or I wouldn't be sitting here, would I? With a microphone on. Okay, so, if the point is here, if you really think, as Yudkowsky thinks, for example, that this system is going to kill everybody, then you'd want to do something about it. Now, I'm not personally in favor of bombing data centers, not least because I don't think it would work. And I just don't think, I think if you take a step back, and you go right back to the discussion we had earlier about this being a way of seeing. Okay, you can, in fact, recently I've been reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a kind of interesting discussion of some of these themes back in the 1960s, very famous kind of philosophical Zen novel. Although there's not much Zen in it. It's quite a lot of motorcycle maintenance, but there's not much Zen. There's more talk about Greek philosophers, actually. And in that book, he talks about the notion that, for example, the mindset you have is going to determine the society you have. So if you decide that you don't like capitalism, so you're going to destroy all the factories, well, you could do that. But if you haven't changed the mindset that built them, we just build more factories immediately. And it will be the same thing with data centers. You can have your moratorium, which won't work anyway. You could bomb the data centers, which if they were developing superhuman AIs would be a good idea. But unless you've changed your way of seeing, someone's going to build more of these things. Unless we've actually understood what we're doing, or what we're unleashing, what we're building, they always get built again. Which is always the argument against people like Yudkowsky, because you say, well, if we stopped building AIs, someone else would build them. Which was the same argument they used against nuclear weapons, of course.
And yet, that protest runs throughout this book. You talk with great affection almost about the Fen Tigers, who were these activists who were trying to stop the draining
Luddites
of the
and the Fens, absolutely.
And of course the Luddites who were smashing looms and rejecting the technology in the Industrial Revolution. Do you want to see that kind of activism? Because it wasn't fully clear. There's this kind of polite version of Paul Kingsnorth where it gets more ethereal, and then quite under the surface there is the sense that actually no, this is a devil being created, and something radical and immediate needs to happen to stop it.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, the reason there are those different versions of me is that there are those different versions of me, and actually, yeah, I mean, look, I'm very happy to call myself a Luddite. People always call me a Luddite. I embrace that. Because actually what the Luddites did was they rejected certain types of technology that were going to enslave them. That was the whole basis of the Luddite movement, and it was the basis of what the Fen Tigers did, and it's the basis of what the Amish do in America today. They don't reject all technology because you wouldn't be able to do that. How far do you go back in defining technology? Is writing a technology? Yes, it is. Is creating a fire with 2 sticks a technology? Yes, it is. So technology is what humans do, or at least tool use is what humans do. Can't stop that. But the question I always have, and I go round and round on this, is there a point at which you can stop and say no further? And I don't know if there is. But if we are getting to the point where superhuman AIs are going to be developed, then yes, you probably should be bombing the data centers. And actually what I would like to do if I could is, because I tell you what it is, you can stand back and you can look at the direction of travel here. You can look at the way this mindset of ours is rolling onwards. You can see what it's taking us towards. You can see what these people are trying to build, and you can see what we're all helping to build. And then you say, well, what the hell are we supposed to do about that? And I don't really know, is the honest answer. But look, I mean, I started off when I was like 21 as a road protester, and I believed in non-violent direct action, and I kind of still do. Yeah, but I don't know how you do it.
So there is a circularity there.
There is. Yeah, well, look, I mean, the principle behind that is very Gandhian, and it's very Tolstoyan, which is that if you need to destroy a technology which is going to, in itself, destroy life, then it's a justifiable thing to do if you're not harming people. But I don't know how you would apply that to an interconnected global digital system, because there is no heart. You can't just, there's no central computer that you can just hit with a pickaxe and the whole thing shuts down, which is why it feels more like an interconnected way of seeing the rise of some being, or just the rise of our own slightly warped way of seeing turning into a kind of technological system, like central nervous system. There isn't really any way to shut that down other than seeing differently. So I do move between these poles. It's like, do I think we should bomb data centers, or do I think we should read more Ian McGilchrist, or do I think we should do both? Probably both. But I don't know, and because there's not an easy solution to this. It's not a situation in which there is a problem that you need to solve by thinking hard enough. It's an interconnected thing that has now happened already that we're all living in. And it's very difficult to know what you're supposed to do other than try and live through it and draw your own lines, decide what you're going to do, decide what you're not going to allow to happen, to decide, I mean, I'm not going to ever use an AI, for example. That's my decision. But will I even know if I'm using an AI? If I phone up my bank and the bank's got an AI bank teller and I think it's a human being, I might be using one now if I just do a Google search or something. I mean, who knows? But I think if you don't draw lines and decide what your personal lines are and what your personal ethics are, you're just going to get sucked in.
The other sort of dangerous corner of this book, which again I think you're going to probably be asked about, so it's good to get the practice going early, is how it should relate and how your ideas should relate to the new political right, the kind of movements we're seeing across Europe. Here in the UK, we had that huge march, the Tommy Robinson March last week, where people were very religiously holding images of Charlie Kirk. It would be possible, I think, to read this book and be inspired to go on those kind of marches, in that what you object to is the destruction of original indigenous cultures, and you use the word indigenous. And I think it'd be good to give you the opportunity to sort of clarify that and set it out so that people don't get the wrong idea. I want to read one quote back at you, which is in the passage where you're talking about what you don't like about the West. You remember something that you felt throughout your life. There was something else that made me pucker my lips when I heard the phrase Western civilization, including the insistence that African children should attend Western-style schools and be issued laptops, that India should adopt our patented pharmaceutical medicines, that Pacific Islanders should become Protestant Christians in suits and ties. What do you mean?
Well, what I said. I mean, look, this is the promotion of the global system of Western capitalism around the world, which just erases all cultures and homogenizes them. I'm very clear in the book repeatedly, actually, about what I'm talking about. So I don't think, actually, that anyone who reads this book would remotely be able to get what you said from it. In fact, they wouldn't, because I'm specifically very clear about rejecting it. What's going on? I mean, I don't know what's going on these marches in London. I don't even read the news, really. But this sort of manifestation of Christian nationalism is balls, and I've spoken out about it quite clearly. Actually, I gave a talk a couple of years ago called Against Christian Civilization, which was specifically about the manifestation of what's basically idol worship, where you take Christianity, which is a spiritual path of renunciation and radicalism, and demands to reject wealth and reject the idols of nations and the rest of it, and you turn that somehow into a new crusade of waving pictures of people around and talking about muscular Christianity. It's just the endless corruption of the Christian faith that's been going on for 2,000 years, and it's absolute nonsense. And in terms of indigeneity, I would never talk about that in an uncomplicated way. I'm actually very clear in the book when I do talk about that, and I'm also very clear about what I'm against, which is all this kind of stuff you're talking about, and I've always been against that. Because it's a corruption of what we're actually talking about. Once you start talking about cultural purity or racial purity or whatever this sort of stuff is that can get into, at least on the hard right, then you've been suckered. And I think what is actually happening at the moment is to go back to that cry. I mean, I start the book by talking about Simone Weil's book, The Need for Roots. And Simone Weil is certainly not any kind of right-wing or far-right character, but she writes this book during the Nazi occupation of Europe, actually. And she's French, and she's fighting for the Free French in London. And she says, everyone is uprooted in the modern world. And what the Nazis have done is they've taken that concern and they've turned it into this hideous, monstrous racial thing. How can we actually root ourselves again without getting sucked in by that? What are the two extremes? The two extremes of communism at the time, which creates this theory of a utopian global world in which everyone's exactly the same everywhere. And then you've got sort of fascism or Nazism over here, extreme nationalism, where people put walls up and start sending people to camps. I think it's almost a trauma response, some of this stuff. I think people are to come back to that culture war again, which is exactly why I try not to fight it. And I think it's a trap. People feel uprooted in so many different ways. They want easy answers. And some of that hard right stuff is easy answers to that. And it's the wrong answers usually. But then, of course, the left has its own easy answers. It has its own very kind of postmodern answers, many of which often involve just dismissing people's need for roots at all. So you have to be able to talk about this in an intelligent way and in a sensitive way, which I hope I've done in the book. I don't think anyone could seriously read that and not be very clear about what I'm for and what I'm not. But, be careful of idol worship. Don't worship the idols of nations or the idols of false versions of Christianity or religion, anything that involves you raging against a bunch of people who are different to you, whatever side you're on. You're in trouble. Now, it doesn't mean you can't have the serious discussions about what it actually means to be rooted and what you should actually be doing politically. But I really see what's happening in the West at the moment as a manifestation of that massive process of uprooting and just people on all sides of the spectrum trying to come up with answers for it. But I don't think you can answer it through simple political slogans. It's not a political problem
And I
in that sense.
suppose even since you wrote this in the last year, that the sense of that anti-machine reaction taking kind of surprising and harder-edged manifestations has just increased.
Well, also, I don't think it is an anti-machine reaction. I mean, if you look at, look at the Trump administration in America, look at the MAGA movement, they are absolutely all in for AI. They are all in for technocracy. One of the things that Trump is doing, and may have already have done, I don't know, is to remove all of the regulations on AI development. Because those guys, just like the Labour government in Britain, are absolutely convinced that technological development, the rapid progress of the machine, digitization of everything, the Internet of Things is the way forward. So it's not anti-machine at all. What it does is it takes certain things that people are concerned about, like cultural change or immigration, which people are concerned about, and something has to be done about. And it's almost like a bit of a bait and switch, some of this stuff, right? So you almost feel like you're talking about the restoration of traditional culture or something, whatever that quite means. But the same people who are talking about that are, Elon Musk is in the administration. They're being funded by Silicon Valley. They're taking down all the walls to development. So I actually don't think it's anti-machine at all in any thoughtful way. I think it's kind of, weirdly, I feel like both the left and the right are currently very reactionary. They're both stuck in their own past. They're both stuck in their version of what an ideal world should look like, both of which are very simple and neither of which take the march of the actual machine seriously enough.
So there is a good version of being reactionary, is there not? I mean, you claim that label at the end of the book. You say that radical reactionary is something that would be a label you would feel comfortable with.
Well, reactionary radical. It's the other way around.
Reactionary radical.
That's a different thing.
I've got to say, as a reader, if reactionary means hating the modern world and everything about it, and kind of yearning for something that went before, it does feel fair, and maybe that should be claimed, and there should be a good version of that. What is the reactionary
Interesting
radical?
word, right? So where does this word mean? Where does this word come from? It really comes from the French Revolution. The word reactionary. It's a very bad word now. Your wonderful Mary Harrington decided to reclaim this word and call herself a reactionary feminist because that's what people started calling her. So she thought, well, maybe I am one then. So then she wrote a whole book about it, which was very good. I don't call myself a radical reactionary. What I do is I'm sort of trying to work out what my politics is, because I'm confused and so is everybody else. If I write articles for a broadly conservative audience, I usually get a load of comments underneath calling me a Marxist. And if I write articles for left-wing publications, I usually get called a reactionary or a fascist. So it was kind of, I think that means I'm doing something right. But I came across this book by Craig Calhoun, which is about the Luddites. And he uses this phrase, which I loved. And I thought, well, maybe this is what I am. And actually, when I look back at my work, maybe these are the people I've been writing about in my other books as well. My first book was a tour of anti-globalization movements around the world, from Brazilian farmers to tribal activists in West Papua to anti-consumerists in America. And Calhoun uses this phrase, reactionary radicals. And he's got a bit of a critique of E.P. Thompson, the Marxist historian, going on. And he says, look, you can't divide people at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution into these two simple categories of workers or capitalists, the working class and the bourgeoisie. Because what the Luddites are doing in communities like them, including the Fen Tigers that you discussed earlier, is they're trying to resist the coming of the factory system, the coming of capitalism, because they can see it's going to completely destroy them. It's going to destroy their industry. It's going to turn them into wage slaves. It's going to destroy their households. So they're reactionary in that sense. They are reacting against that system, which is a good thing. But they're radical as well, because they don't react against it because they want to go back to a past that was perfect. They want changes as well, right? They want things that will actually benefit them, because the system currently does not benefit them. But he calls these people reactionary radicals. And I think if you look at tribal people in India resisting dams, or the West Papuans resisting logging firms and the Indonesian government, or the Fen Tigers or the Luddites throughout history, what you can see is reactionary radicals. You can see people fighting the machine, but from a perspective of wanting a radically different way of living. So it's not a simple sort of reaction where you just go, oh, everything was wonderful, let's go back to that. But neither is it an ideological radicalism like you would get with the Marxists, where you say, well, we've got a grand utopian theory of everything and we're just going to impose that now, even if we have to kill everyone and put them into camps. It's based on human scale culture, but it reacts against the machine. So I like that. I like that as a phrase. It's the best description I've ever heard of what I think I believe in. And you mentioned earlier that I used to be a greenie, and I still regard myself as a bit of an environmentalist, but the green movement I came out of when I was a young activist in the early 90s was pretty much a reactionary radical movement. And if you look at the likes of E.F. Schumacher or Leopold Kohr, or many of the early green thinkers, even if you look at people like maybe Tolstoy or Gandhi that I mentioned earlier, you could say that that was a label you could apply to them if you want to. So it's as good a way of thinking as anything. I think we have to have, if we're going to talk about politics and a way of seeing, you have to have a politics that is rooted in those 4 Ps, that's rooted in the past, that's rooted in reality, it's rooted in nature, but that doesn't idolize them or turn them into excuses to hate a bunch of people who aren't the same as you, which is the problem that we've got at the moment, and that's what the right's going to end up doing if it's not very careful indeed. And a lot of this politics on the right and the left at the moment is just based on fear. And if you fear anyone, whether it's the woke left or the immigrants or whatever, even if there are some real issues under there that actually need to be addressed, you're just going to get defensive, and then you're going to start lashing out whoever you think the other team is. And, oh, look, social media will make that really easy for you, and there'll be an algorithm that tells you exactly who to hate, and here's a video, which is a 5-second clip of somebody saying a bad thing. Why don't you go and hate them? It's like the 4 minutes hate or the 2 minutes hate from Orwell's 1984. So you have to have, I think if you're going to talk about politics, you have to have one that's rooted in eternal things. People, place, prayer, the past, however you want to formulate it. But it also has to be against the machine, literally. And it has to be very, very careful that whatever it does not become the worship of an idol and the excuse to project your anger and fear onto somebody else, which is why, for me, my Christianity is important. Because if you're going to be a Christian and actually try and be a Christian properly, and I wouldn't claim I'm very good at it, you actually can't do that, because the 2 great commandments are you love God and you love your neighbor. And by the way, says Christ, everyone is your neighbor. That's what the Good Samaritan is about. So you actually have to try and do the thing that is possible for you to do that is a good thing in your life at the human scale. And I think you need a politics that's rooted in the human scale and that avoids machine thinking. And, you look at the 2 extremes of machine thinking in the 20th century. As I say, you get Nazism, you get communism. Supposedly they're the right and the left of the spectrum, but actually more or less they're the same thing in reality, in terms of being giant totalitarian systems that crush people and choose who the enemy is. That's the thing you've got to avoid.
I notice there's not much Christianity in this book, and you've written and spoken about how you have converted to the Eastern Church. Is that for you now part of your resistance, or part of what you were talking about, which is how to live in the micro frame against the machine? I mean, should religion be more part of this discussion?
Well, if it's real religion, yes, as opposed to this kind of idol worship we were just talking about. I mean, I was in the process of becoming Christian when I wrote this book, and it isn't a Christian book for Christians or something. I'm not trying to push a line, but I think it's got a sort of Christian thread running through it, just because it's difficult for me not to write about that now. When I gave this talk against Christian civilization about a year or 2 ago in America, actually. In fact, I wonder if I can remember the quote I started it with. There's a Native American activist called Ohiesa from the mid-19th century who lived through the Battle of Little Bighorn against Custer. Actually, he was a teenager when that happened, and he saw his whole culture destroyed, but he also became a Christian. He wrote an autobiography called The Soul of an Indian, which is very good. And he has this quote in there. When I first read it, it really leapt out at me, and I used it as the basis for this talk. And he says, basically, I hear all these Christians saying these wonderful things, and this Jesus Christ seems an incredible man, but I'm not seeing many of these Christians actually living it. He said, they seem to be quite good at going around the world telling everyone else to live it, not very good at living it themselves. But he has this particular phrase. He says, if you actually look at what Christ teaches, and then if you look at what modern Western civilization is, modern civilization and Christianity are opposed and irreconcilable. That's what he says. In other words, if you actually read the Gospels and you try to live the way that Christ tells you to live, which is extremely radical and extremely self-sacrificing, you couldn't build the machine. And you certainly couldn't run around pretending that, Christianity was a huge cultural, political weapon in your culture war, because it isn't. And I'm just, I'm still on this journey. And I'm sort of both want to talk about it all the time, but I'm slightly reluctant to, because I'm not a great theologian. I'm just a guy. But there is something exceptionally radical about the Gospels. And if you read them and try to follow them, that's a lifetime's work in itself. And if you got halfway there even, you wouldn't be able to have this machine mentality that we're talking about. You just wouldn't. And any so-called Christianity that tries to ally itself with it is a corruption of what you're actually reading, I think. And when you actually read the Gospels, of course, you're endlessly challenged by the fact that you're not living them most of the time. And they're almost impossible to live in many ways. But as I said, if you even walk 10% of the way there, you'd be walking out of the machine, actually. I think it would be.
I have a question, Paul, about how your thinking relates to Dugald Hines. You were very close collaborators. You co-wrote the Dark Mountain Manifesto. He's written, as many people in this room maybe have read, At Work in the Ruins, also deeply critical of modernity, but with some elements of hope woven into it, of what would come after a collapse of modernity. So I'm just curious how your own thinking now relates to his and whether your path has diverged.
So Dugald and I wrote the Dark Mountain Manifesto in 2009, which was an artist's manifesto, writer's manifesto, which was exactly a call for being honest about the fact that we were living through a cultural and civilizational collapse, and we should write like that was actually true, instead of pretending that it wasn't. So we share that kind of, that sense that, I mean, to go back to this conversation about how, you know, do you let the West die, or is it already dead? Is it just a concept that's gone? I think we actually share that perspective. I think that's what Dugald is really arguing. The ruins are already here. You're trying to project sort of the collapse of things forward. It's not really very useful. I mean, it depends what you mean by collapse. We're not living in an economic collapse yet, luckily, or at least not completely, but culturally, there's nothing holding us together. So what do you actually do? Will you start again? And that's what I share with Dugald, actually, is that sense that it's a good time to start again. It's always a good time to start again. I mean, this is what happens when cultures rise and fall. I mean, people start again, they go to the edges, and they start building, which is really what I'm talking about. So I think that's where we come together, actually, is a lot of that sense of if you want, you know, a positive vision, that's the positive vision, actually. The fact that a lot of the old stories don't work anymore is, you know, you could find that depressing if you wanted, or you could find it exhilarating. And you could say, okay, let's get back to the roots of things. Let's get back to the real stuff and see if we can build something new and interesting. So, yeah, I think that's what we share on that.
What I wanted to ask, so you talked about enclosure, you talked about the Industrial Revolution, you compared it to the digital revolution. And I was wondering if you would be able to kind of extend that analogy backwards, and is there anything that you could identify as sort of preying upon or disrupting our mental labor, our mental attention, that has kind of paved the way for the digital revolution?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about the machine as a process of enclosure, basically. The first part of the book, which is a sort of potted history of how this thing came to be. I talk about enclosure quite a lot. I've done a lot of work on it and been to a lot of places in the world where it's still happening in my time, and I see this process of not just the enclosure of land, but the enclosure of minds and ways of seeing as being central to it. So you can't have an industrial revolution unless you have enclosure, unless you've stolen the land from the people and turned it into giant efficient fields and then forced the people to go to the factories because they can't make a living on their land anymore. Then you don't get capitalism and you don't get empire. And the process of Western empires was really a process of extending that enclosure model around the world. So we could see what's going on now as a process of digital enclosure, I think. And we talked right at the beginning about this sense of feeling like you're in a net that's being drawn in. And that's what is happening. Is it possible for you to exist in this world now without a digital presence? It's very, very hard. You can do it, but you have to be prepared to live right on the edges of society. And I know some people who do that, but it's difficult, especially if you have a family or something, you know, and you have to earn a living. How are you supposed to do it? So we've all been enclosed in that sense that we're forced to live inside this digital system. We're forced to have little computers in our pockets. We're being monitored all the time. We've got algorithms firing stuff into our face all the time. And to go back to the culture war, there wouldn't be a culture war of anything like this ferocity if there weren't smartphones and social media. There's no way. Because that's not to say that there aren't cultural issues that we would be fighting over, legitimate ones, but we wouldn't be fighting over them like this, in this way that has, you can see people who, you know, you consider to be intelligent people just being manipulated by the algorithm and turned into rage-filled monsters, and you can see it in yourself half the time if you're not careful. So that's a process of enclosure. It's almost as if we've moved from having our land enclosed to having our minds enclosed. It's like the next stage. So if you want to be a digital Luddite or a digital fen tiger, how are you going to get your mind back? How are you going to pull down the fences? That's the question. How are you going to reclaim your way of thinking and your way of seeing? Those are really good questions to ask, I think.
I founded the Unplugged Coalition, which aims to reclaim childhood from addictive technology. And I just, seeing the declining literacy rates, the rise in poor mental health for children, we're seeing just a range of factors, increasing self-harm and things. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on the machine and its impact on the very essence of growing minds, and how the change of childhood is changing what it means to be human.
Is there not a risk that if we demonize the machine, technology, whatever, that we actually cede strategic relevance to places like China, Russia, our enemies, and all of the benefits that we have from our security, such as freedom, disappear as a result of that?
Can you demonize the machine if it's already a demon? That's the question. Look, I mean, I'm the problem with that argument is, firstly, the things that you identify as things of the West, like modernity, like free markets and individualism, the rest of it, they're actually the fruits of the post-Enlightenment liberal revolution, which has created a certain type of worldview. And that worldview is very much tied in with the uprooting of all previous ways of seeing. I think there's a major problem with I talk about this quite a lot in the book, that one thing we haven't discussed tonight is this notion of liberation. Sometimes liberation is a good thing, but we've got to the point now where we are attempting, and we have been attempting for the last 200 years, to liberate ourselves from everything, including our culture, including our history, including nature itself, and actually including our own bodies. I mean, this is the next stage, and this is what transhumanism is about. It's about what Kevin Kelly, the Silicon Valley philosopher, calls our ongoing liberation from matter. Right, so this is what we're doing now. We're liberating ourselves from everything. So this notion that, hooray for liberalism and free markets and individualism, isn't that great? Let's weaponize that and go and get the enemy. I think it's a trap. I mean, it depends what scale you think you're fighting on. If you're talking about geopolitics, there's always going to be geopolitics, and there are always going to be these battles. And you're right, no one's going to listen to me. I mean, no one's going to listen to some guy like Eliza Yudkowsky saying bomb the data centers. That's not going to happen. We are going to rush into AI in the same way we rushed into nuclear weapons and every other advanced technology, because we don't have control over this, and because we're competing tribal factions, because that's what we do. The question you have to ask, or we have to ask, is, do we actually want to compete on this playing field? Where are we going? Where does this actually go? What's our aim here? Are we beating China in the AI race? For what? What are we creating? Do we actually want to live in the world that we're creating? Or are we going to take a step back and say, is this actually right? I don't have any optimism that will actually happen, but I'm not going to involve myself in a situation in which I say, well, yeah, I think this thing is evil, but, they're more evil. So let's double down on the evil race. It just, it's almost like the old discussion about nuclear arms, right? I mean, what do you want to do here? Do you want to go unilateral, or do you want to take part in the arms race? The arms race was always going to happen. And now we're in an AI race.
It's a fair question, I think. And
it is.
The China example is a very neat one, because hard to think of a more machine society, perhaps, than China. I mean, they didn't go through any of those stages, like enclosure we talked about. They skipped it and went straight for a cultural revolution where uprooting everyone was part of the plan, and the digital panopticon and all the rest of it. Are you more frightened by a sort of Chinese model even than you are the Western one?
Well, what China is the West on steroids, actually, because what they do is they take Marxism, which is a Western economic and political theory, and they apply it in the mid-20th century, as you say, at super speed, much as the Russians tried to do in the 1910s, although their model fell apart, but the Chinese model doesn't look like it is falling apart. China is where you could end up going. I mean, this is true, right? In China, they already have the panopticon that they live in. We discussed this during COVID, right? Are we actually heading down that same route? Are we taking the same tools of digital monitoring and control that they use over there? So the way that it works in China is terrifying. You're right. It's the ultimate machine society.
Is it worse than the West?
Well, yeah, clearly, because it takes the same way of seeing and applies it in a rigid and totalitarian sense. So, well, it depends what you mean by the West again, but if you're talking about the machine and this kind of galloping way of seeing, which is rationalistic and technocratic and authoritarian and technological, then the Chinese are doing that very well. They're highly efficient. So, I mean, that is true. That's a fair question to ask. But it depends on what you're standing up for, doesn't it? I don't think we know what we're standing up for yet. I don't think we know what we're defending. And the danger is that we just race towards the same thing as them at top speed. And, the West is becoming very much more like China. This country is becoming very much more like China in terms of the way that people are monitored and controlled than it was even 10 years ago. I don't know. I don't really know how to answer the geopolitical question.
Well, let's go on to the other question,
happen.
Which is how is childhood being affected by
totally, and we all know
the
it
screens,
is. And,
by the machine.
And the evidence is all there, and all the work that's been done by people like Jonathan Haidt and others is pretty clear-cut. I mean, we didn't give our children any screens. They've never had smartphones. They've never had tablets. I have teenagers now, so they have laptops they can do their schoolwork on, but we're careful what they use them for. I actually think these things really, really addle the brains of children. I think that's very clear. The evidence is in. I mean, they addle the brains of adults, but they're particularly bad if you give them to developing minds. And they will create children who cannot concentrate and who are manipulated by an algorithm. I actually think it's culturally urgent to keep children off these things. And I think it should be, and that's if we're going to have a state, it should be legislating for things like that. And it's quite possible to do that, by the way. I think the Australian government's just banned smartphones for under 16s. These things are possible, and they ought to happen, because in an incredibly short period of time, about 10 years, these miniature devices, which have come out of nowhere and are basically like addictive drugs, have been given to a bunch of 2-year-olds. And that is causing a massive crisis. And it's actually easy to stop it if enough parents get together and say, we're not doing it. And that ought to happen. So we ought to be fundamentalist about that one.
Overlapping with that question, but a slightly different spin on it. As a parent, how do you actually rear children nowadays? What do you advise them to study? Should you even have children? More children if you already have any?
Antinatalism, and how should we even have children these days?
Well, I've got 2 and I like them. So no, I mean, I used to be a greenie, and I was always very torn up about this question of whether you should have children and the rest of it. I've changed my view on that quite a lot since I became a Christian, and since I started thinking about the machine as well. I actually think children are a very good thing, and that you should create children who actually love the earth and can create a better world. And since the birth rates are collapsing, we don't have to worry too much about overpopulation in the same way. But I don't think there's no mileage in a kind of antinatalism where we say, oh, let's just stop having children and live these kind of strange, lonely lives. I mean, some people don't want to have children, that's fine, but for those who do, actually the urgency is to try and create a world in which you can bring children up well. I mean, if we want to talk about the machine at a really micro level, everybody knows that children on these devices is a really bad thing. We can all see it. Most parents are worried about it. Lots of them let their kids have phones just because they have to, because everyone else has a phone. So everyone feels this enormous pressure to do something to their children which actually no one's really comfortable with, or very few people are really comfortable with. And by the way, the people in Silicon Valley, most of them send their children to Steiner schools and don't let them have any smartphones, right? Which is rather telling, because these things are destructive. They are like drugs. So having children is a good thing if you want to have children, if you bring them up well. But I actually think that a parental revolution on this subject could go a long way. I actually think if enough parents get together and do something different and call for things to be different, then that is a way you could really push back very fast, because this digital revolution has happened in 10 to 15 years. The iPhone's invented in 2007. It's hardly any time at all. It's not that difficult in practical terms to push that back, at least some way, and certainly for children. So we should do that. We should have lots of children, and then we should bring them up to be against the machine.
So, I'm going to lay my cards on the table slightly here before I ask a question. I would probably describe myself as a kind of romantic socialist of a kind, a Marxist of a sort as well. Nothing that you said tonight I would find objectionable or, would kind of go against my own kind of political or philosophical social beliefs. I suppose the question I think that, I was thinking actually when you were talking of a Marxist historian called Raphael Samuel, who wrote an essay just after the miners' strike. And he talked about that the miners' strike was actually a kind of, I think he almost said almost exactly the same words that you and Craig Calhoun used, that this is a kind of, I think he said a conservative radicalism. It's a radicalism in conservation of a way of life that is being lost to capitalism, the machine, whatever you want to call it. I suppose my question I'm left with, and often left with when I read your work, and I have done for a long time now, is what are your politics, I suppose? And I suppose that's what kind of Freddie was kind of circling around a couple of times as well, or perhaps a better way to ask is, who are the political thinkers now, contemporary political thinkers, that you most class yourself as aligned with, or that you most find kind of generative to think with or through?
Well, honestly, I would find it difficult to answer directly because I think a lot of my politics is conservative and some of it is radical and some of it is anarchist. And you talk about socialism in the sense that if you were talking about a small s sort of romantic William Morrissey socialism, I'd be up for it. Bring it on. It's very difficult to answer the question. That's why I like to call myself a reactionary radical, because I think the defense of human scale values against machine values is my politics. I don't think you can necessarily place that on a left-right spectrum, because I don't think the left-right spectrum is particularly useful anymore. I mean, it comes from the French Revolution, where on the left side of the house you have the revolutionaries, on the right side of the house you have the defenders of the monarchy. And throughout the 20th century, it basically meant the right was broadly in favour of sort of capitalism and liberalism and freedom, and the left was broadly in favour of statism, socialism, communism in a very top-down model. Those have all fallen apart now. So, what do we think is right or is left-wing now? It's very difficult to answer the question. So I would call myself a reactionary radical. In terms of political figures that inspire me, there aren't many around. That's the problem. If you're a reactionary radical, where would you find them? I mean, Wendell Berry would be the obvious example. Some recently dead figures would be people like Ivan Illich, or some of the many people I quote in the book, like Lewis Mumford. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with a more reactionary, traditionalist, small c conservative, Scruton-esque way of seeing in many ways, but I'm also very opposed to, probably my class background, I just don't like overweening power, and I don't like landlords owning 90% of the country, and I don't like squirearchies and the rest of it. So I actually think that's an old English tradition, and it's a tradition that you find manifested in a lot of other countries as well, and it comes from this sense of ordinary people being against overweening power, but also, as you say, wanting to defend human-scale traditions. It's why I tried to find a term for that. So I'm not sure that's answered your question at all. Because it's difficult to find a category to put your politics in. You might have the same problem. As soon as you do, then people can start arguing with you, and you might find you don't really fit into it properly.
I took a kind of Cliff Notes ultra summary here. Alongside Lewis Mumford, writers that get a lot of airtime in the book are Oswald Spengler, Christopher Lash, Wendell Berry, Yoram Hazony, Ivan Illich, Patrick Deneen, and we end up with René Guénon, the ultra traditionalist, perennialist, who we had a whole session about here.
You missed Simone Weil as well.
I missed Simone Weil, sorry, yes.
It's an eclectic
Simone
mix.
Weil gives a different flavour.
If you see the internet or the machine as a tool, and a tool can be used to put to a good purpose or a bad purpose, the way you've talked tonight, it's almost like all purposes are bad. Would you instead say that you could actually put it to a good purpose? And if so, what would that good purpose be?
Well, I'm not sure whether it is a tool. I think there might be a difference between a tool and a technology. And I think it's also really important to understand that technologies are very rarely actually neutral. They take you in a certain direction. So maybe you could look at a very, very simple technology like a knife, and you could say, okay, that is broadly a neutral technology. You could use it to cut up some vegetables, or you could use it to stab someone to death, and you choose which one you want to do. But when you look at something like, for example, a smartphone, or like the internet, at least in the way that it's developed now, it can only come out of a certain mindset. It can only come out of a certain way of seeing that's very rationalistic and very technological. And it can only really take you in a certain direction. So yeah, you could use your smartphone to look at porn or send someone hateful messages, or you could use a prayer app or something like that. So in that sense, you can do good things on the internet, like reading my wonderful Substack or something. Or lots of the research that I did for this book, right? Yeah, okay, it's a collection of knowledge. In that sense, it can be useful, but it has a direction of travel. So the existence of the internet, and particularly the existence of smartphones, the portable internet, and particularly the existence of social media, which is very algorithmic and very limbic in its sense of creating dependency, is always going to take you in a direction which is more of the machine, more screens, more time on your smartphones. How many people do we see just looking at these things all the time? Endlessly in restaurants, on trains, all over the place, because they're difficult to resist. So even though you might be able to do good things on them, they're not neutral in that sense. They're never neutral. They take you in a certain direction. You have to understand that. Technology has a telos. It does something to you. So you could use it for good, yes, but it's still taking you in a direction. It's actually taking you, I think, in the transhumanist direction all the time. So Marshall McLuhan talked about that as well, actually. He said he was talking about media specifically, he said the notion that the content of a particular medium actually matters, the notion that the message actually matters, is completely naive. He said the message that a particular media is coming across has about as much relevance as the stenciling on the shell casing of an atomic bomb. Right? In other words, you've got this enormous technology that is creating a whole way of seeing and a whole society around you, and yeah, it may convey a good thing or a bad thing, but the actual superstructure is the thing that is defining your way of seeing. So I think we just need to have this intelligent critique of what these technologies actually do and what sort of thing they're forming us into. To go back to the question about children, for example, what sort of thing, how are our children being formed by just possessing these things, even if they're doing educational materials on them sometimes?
To be a Christian in the world, where are the practical boundaries drawn with the machine? And if I could present you perhaps a little foil, in the Gospel of St. Luke, Jesus does say, make friends with evil mammon for the sake of good. And I wonder how that might tie in with how we live with the machine.
Well, what he also says, of course, is that we mustn't resist evil. I mean, he's very clear. He actually says, don't resist evil. So my old book's a waste of time. I've been wasting 5 years of my life. I mean, it's a very good question, actually. And I maybe, this is still something I'm swimming in. I've only been a Christian for 6 years or so it's not that long. So I can't give you a sort of rounded theological answer to that. It's a process. But I think that if you are a Christian, or indeed if you are any other religion, or you have any serious philosophy, you have a set of things that you believe in, and you have a set of things you know to be right, and a set of things you know to be wrong, and you have a set of teachings about how you're supposed to live your life, and so you should try and follow them, and your relationship with the machine will follow from that, I think. And if you're trying to live humbly and you're trying to love your neighbor, but you're also trying to give away your wealth and not resist, but avoid mammon and live very simply and not give a thought for the morrow, because the lilies of the field and the birds of the air are clothed by the Father without them having to worry about it. If you were actually to live as a Christian, there's an enormous freedom actually in the Gospels, a real huge freedom of just literally just go out into the world barefoot and don't worry about it. The number of times that Jesus tells people not to worry and not to fear is really good, and it's very easy to look at the machine and get very fearful and depressed and worried. But actually, my favorite line in the whole Bible, be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. Isn't that great? If that's true, and if you believe that's true, then the machine will come and go, and we have to try and live as Christians within it. And if we're trying to read the Gospels and follow them, then the way that we relate to it follows from that, I think, is the only answer I can give. And it may be that you need to worry less about the machine than I do. On the other hand, I think you need to keep your vigilance up, because I think something quite evil is manifesting. And however you relate to that, even if you're not afraid of it, it's good to be aware of what's going on. Because I think your faith, our faith, is going to be challenged by all of this. Because especially if we think we're creating new gods out there, if superhuman intelligences are manifesting, we've got a whole new set of things to think about. But, at heart, the Gospels are really simple. They're very difficult to live, but they're actually very simple in practice. So, yeah, maybe we just need to focus on actually living them, or maybe I do. It's probably the best answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is all we're going to have time for today. Please join me in, just before we give Paul the round of applause he deserves. What a pleasure and an honour it has been on this, the day of publication. He's about to embark on a 20-stop tour of America with much, much larger audiences than this. It was fantastic that you chose UnHerd to launch this most interesting and important book. And come again. Thanks, guys. Thank you for coming.